You're listening to Podcast Station. These stories are not legends. They're not campfire tales. They are recorded accounts from people who worked the edges of civilization, rangers, officers, search teams, who saw something in the wild that was never meant to be understood. What you're about to hear is a first-hand testimony. Listen carefully. Some details are easy to miss the first time. The first time I understood that the forest was listening to me, truly listening, was on a night so quiet I could hear my own pulse knocking against my ears. I have spent most of my adult life walking under pine canopies taller than cathedrals, breathing air that smells like sap, cold stone, and old rain. I was not born into fear of the woods. Quite the opposite. I trusted them the way a person trusts gravity, something always there, invisible, dependable. That trust came from years of routine, from maps memorized and trails walked so often my boots seemed to know the way without me. I am a forest ranger. I have been for a long time, long enough that the job stopped feeling like a uniform and started feeling like skin. I was in my mid-30s when these stories truly began, stationed in a stretch of national forest that locals referred to only by an old name they rarely said out loud. The kind of place where cell signal drops without warning, where compasses hesitate, where the pines grow closer together the farther you walk from the roads. The locals lived at the edges, cabins scattered like afterthoughts, and they treated the interior the way sailors treat deep water, necessary, respected, but never challenged without reason. They were polite to me, friendly even, but there was always a pause when I told them where I patrolled, a look exchanged, a subtle tightening of the mouth, as if I had just mentioned working night shifts in a graveyard no one buried anyone in anymore. At first, I chalked it up to superstition. Every forest has its stories. People get lost, hear things, invent explanations because the truth, that nature is vast and indifferent, is harder to swallow. That was my thinking then. Clean, rational, comfortable. I didn't know yet how thin that comfort really was. The forest itself was beautiful in a way that felt almost deliberate. Pines packed tight, their trunks dark and straight, needles high above, filtering sunlight into pale green shafts. During the day, it felt calm, predictable. At night, though, the same trees seemed to lean inward, their branches knitting together overhead until the stars disappeared. Sound behaved strangely there. Footsteps carried too far, whispers didn't travel far enough, and sometimes noise seemed to come from nowhere specific at all. Just a pressure against the ears, like the forest was clearing its throat. My job was simple on paper: patrol trails, check campsites, assist lost hikers, monitor wildlife, keep people safe from the forest and the forest safe from people. I believed in that balance. I believed I was good at it. The first incident that unsettled me enough to linger in my thoughts happened on an early autumn evening. The air was cooling fast, the kind of cold that sneaks in under your collar and settles along the spine. I was finishing a routine patrol when I heard a sound that made me stop mid-step. It was a knock, not a thump, not a branch snapping, a knock. 3 beats, evenly spaced, hollow, and deliberate. There were no structures near me, no cabins, no trail markers close enough to make that sound. The noise came from deeper in the trees, slightly downhill, where the forest thickened and the ground dipped toward a limestone ridge honeycombed with old caves. I waited, listened. Nothing. I told myself it was wood on wood, wind shifting something just right. The brain loves patterns. It invents them when silence gets uncomfortable. I took another step. Again, the knock. 3 beats. This time closer. I remember the exact thought that crossed my mind then, clear as if someone else put it there. That's not how sound should move. I called out, identifying myself the way we're trained to. My voice sounded wrong in that place, too loud and too thin at the same time. No answer came back. Just the faintest echo, distorted, like the forest was repeating me under its breath. I didn't investigate further that night. Protocol allowed discretion, and instinct, something I hadn't yet learned to respect, told me to leave. As I walked back toward the trail, I became aware of something else. The smell. Not rot, not decay. Something sharper. Animal, but wrong. Musky and cold, like wet fur left too long in shade. It clung to the air, grew stronger for a few steps, then vanished as abruptly as it appeared. I slept poorly that night, dreamed of caves I couldn't see the end of knocking that came from inside my chest. In the weeks that followed, things escalated, not dramatically, not in ways that demanded reports or explanations. Subtle changes, small inconsistencies, sounds where there should have been none. Silence where birdsong should have been constant. Once, I found a set of footprints along a muddy trail that made no sense at all. Too large, too deep, almost human in shape, but stretched, elongated, as if whatever made them had tried to walk upright and failed. I told myself bears can do strange things. So can moose. So can fear. The locals stopped meeting my eyes when I mentioned patrol routes near the ridge. One older man, his beard yellowed from tobacco, finally said something that stuck with me. "The pines remember," he muttered, not quite looking at me, "and they don't forgive curiosity." I laughed it off. I regret that now. The night that broke, something inside me began like any other. A routine check near the cave system after a report of strange noises from a remote campsite. I went alone. I always did back then. Confidence has a way of isolating you. By the time darkness fell fully, the forest felt different, heavier. The air pressed against my skin, damp and cold. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than usual, swallowed by the trees instead of reflecting back. And then I heard it again. The knock. Closer than ever. This time, it didn't come from the trees. It came from inside the cave. I stood at the mouth of that dark opening, the smell hitting me full force now, thick and suffocating. The knock echoed once more, and with it came a sound that finally stripped away my rationalizations. Breathing. Slow, deep, patient. I realized then that the forest wasn't just listening. It had been waiting, and somewhere in the dark beyond that cave entrance, something was learning the sound of my fear. I didn't step into the cave that night. That decision, more than any other, is the reason I'm still alive to tell this. I stood there longer than I should have, frozen at the threshold, my breath fogging in front of me as if the cold had found a way to crawl out of the stone itself. The cave mouth looked different the longer I stared at it. Wider, not physically, not in a way I could measure, but perceptually, like my eyes couldn't quite agree on its shape. The darkness inside wasn't empty. It felt occupied, dense, the way a room feels when someone is standing just out of sight. The breathing stopped. That terrified me more than if it had continued. Silence in the forest is never neutral. It's not the absence of sound, it's the presence of attention. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if something had passed through that flipped a switch I couldn't see. I backed away slowly, every step deliberate, my heel carefully finding ground before my weight followed. I kept my light trained on the cave entrance, half expecting something to surge out of it in a rush of movement and noise. Nothing did. The darkness stayed perfectly still. When I finally turned my back and began the long walk out, the smell followed me for several minutes, fading inch by inch like something reluctant to let go. I didn't file a full report. I noted strange sounds, possible wildlife activity. I told myself the truth would sound ridiculous, and worse, that it would give the experience more weight than it deserved. That was my first real act of denial, and it set the tone for everything that came after. The forest noticed. Over the next few months, my patrol area seemed to shrink without actually changing. Trails felt longer, distances stretched. I would leave my vehicle certain of the route ahead, only to find myself an hour later somewhere I didn't expect to be, compass needle wavering, as if confused by something underground. Once, I found myself standing at the cave ridge again with no memory of choosing that direction. I began hearing sounds at night while stationed in the ranger cabin near the forest interior. Soft ones at first, footsteps circling the structure, too slow and measured to be animals. I would hold my breath, listening, counting the seconds between each step. Sometimes they stopped directly outside the door. Other times they moved away, only to return hours later from a different direction. The knocking returned too, always 3 beats, always at night. Never on the door itself, always on the walls, the floor, the underside of the cabin, as if something was testing the structure from every angle. I checked for signs each morning. Tracks, scratches, disturbances in the soil. There were none. The ground remained pristine, pine needles undisturbed, mud smooth and untouched. It was as if whatever came at night had learned how not to leave evidence. Sleep became a series of shallow dozes, punctuated by jolting wakefulness. My dreams changed. They became heavier, slower, filled with spaces that felt too large to exist. I dreamed of walking through pines that grew closer together with every step, their trunks bending inward until I had to turn sideways to pass. I dreamed of caves whose ceilings lowered the farther I walked, forcing me to crawl, my chest scraping stone, breath coming harder as the darkness pressed down. I woke one morning with the distinct impression that I had been standing outside my own cabin all night, listening to myself breathe inside. That was when doubt began to rot my confidence from the inside out. I stopped trusting my instincts. Every flicker of unease I crushed with logic. Every warning bell I silenced with routine. I told myself fear was contagious, that locals passed it down the way they passed down old stories embellished with each telling. I told myself exhaustion explained everything. The forest responded by escalating. The first missing person under my watch was a solo camper, late 40s, experienced, well-equipped. He had checked in at a trailhead station, left a note on his dashboard listing his intended route and return date. When he didn't come back, we initiated a standard search. We found his campsite untouched, fire pit cold, tent zipped from the outside. Inside the tent, his boots were neatly placed side by side, toes pointing toward the opening. No footprints led away. I remember standing there, staring at those boots, feeling something inside me shift permanently. People don't vanish like that. Not without chaos, not without signs of panic or struggle. Unless panic never had time to start. The search expanded. Days passed. Dogs refused to approach the cave ridge. They whined, pulled at their leads, eyes rolling white as they tried to back away. One handler swore he heard something calling the dogs by name from the trees. We laughed nervously, then stopped laughing when he refused to continue. That night, alone in the cabin again, the knocking changed. It came faster, louder, not testing anymore, demanding. And then, for the first time, I heard something else layered beneath it. A voice. Low, broken, almost human. It wasn't saying words, not clearly, but it was shaping sounds the way speech does. Rising and falling, mimicking cadence, practicing. I pressed my back against the wall, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might knock back. My mind raced through explanations, grasping at anything that would anchor me to sanity. Wind through rock, animal vocalizations, stress-induced auditory hallucinations. Then the voice said my name, perfectly, no distortion, no echo. Just my name, spoken the way someone says it when they know you well. That was the moment denial finally cracked. Not shattered, cracked. Enough for something else to seep through. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat with my back to the wall, flashlight on, waiting for dawn like a reprieve from a sentence I hadn't finished serving. When light finally filtered through the trees, it felt thin and weak, like it was afraid of what it might reveal. I requested a transfer soon after, cited stress, fatigue, safety concerns. The paperwork moved slowly. Bureaucracy always does. The forest did not wait. The final escalation came during a winter patrol, snow blanketing the ground in a way that should have made tracking easy. I followed a set of prints I didn't want to admit I recognized. Long strides, deep impressions, too deliberate to be animal. They led me back to the cave. The entrance was wider now. I know how that sounds. I know stone doesn't move like that. But standing there, staring into the dark, I could have sworn the rock had pulled back, like lips parting in anticipation. The smell rolled out thick and suffocating, and with it came warmth, wrong and wet, like breath. I didn't hear knocking this time. I heard laughter, slow, quiet, almost pleased. Something inside me finally gave way. Not courage, not bravery. Survival. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision tunneled, branches tearing at my jacket, snow blinding me as I crashed through drifts without care or direction. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, the place where the pines thinned and the world felt marginally real again. Behind me, deep in the trees, something howled, not in anger, but in frustration, as if I had broken a rule I never knew I was playing by. I left that forest soon after. New assignment, new terrain, different pines, but sometimes late at night, when the wind moves just right through the trees, I hear 3 soft knocks echoing through memory. And I know the spirits of the pines are still whispering, waiting, learning. I believed leaving would be enough. That distance would dull whatever had sharpened its attention on me. New forest, new routines, new names on the map. I told myself geography mattered more than memory. I was wrong. The next assignment placed me farther north, deeper into mountain country where snow lingered in the shadows even in late spring. The forest there was older in a different way, less dense, more vertical, trees rising like pillars with long, empty spaces between them. Wind moved freely, carrying sound farther than it should. At first, that openness felt like relief. No caves, no limestone ridges, no tight corridors of trees closing in, but the quiet followed me. Not the natural quiet of a resting forest, the kind where you still hear wind and needles, distant birds, water moving under ice. This was a hollow quiet like sound had been removed after the fact. I noticed it most at dawn, that moment when night hasn't fully let go and day hasn't yet asserted itself. The forest would hold its breath and I would feel it in my chest, an unconscious mirroring that left me lightheaded. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened at my previous post. Not fully. Pieces, maybe. Vague mentions of stress, overwork. I learned how to shape the story into something that fit comfortably into official language, something survivable. But fear doesn't care about paperwork. The first winter there, a series of disappearances began. Not frequent enough to draw national attention, but consistent enough to unsettle those of us tasked with responding. Hunters who never returned to their trucks. A pair of hikers whose tracks ended abruptly at a frozen stream. A seasonal ranger who failed to check in after a routine patrol and was never seen again. Each time, the forest offered just enough evidence to keep us searching, but never enough to give answers. Boot prints leading nowhere. Broken branches with no blood, radios found powered on, batteries warm as if recently handled. And always, the caves. This region had them too, older, deeper, carved by water over centuries into the bones of the mountains. We mapped them carefully, marked them as hazards. I avoided them as much as I could, though the job demanded proximity. What I couldn't avoid were the sounds. It started with imitation. I would hear radio chatter when my unit was silent. Voices of co-workers, distorted slightly, calling for status updates that never came. Once I responded instinctively, my own voice cracking as it echoed back to me from the trees, warped and delayed. Another time, while checking a remote shelter, I heard someone walking behind me. The rhythm was perfect. Boot on gravel, boot on gravel. Too perfect. When I stopped, it stopped. When I turned, there was nothing but trees and drifting snow. The smell returned too, that cold musk, stronger now, layered with something else, damp stone, old water, the mineral tang of caves that never see sunlight. It clung to my clothes, followed me into vehicles, lingered long after I should have been free of it. I began to understand something then, slowly and unwillingly. This wasn't one place, it was a pattern. The forest didn't need a specific location, it needed attention, familiarity, time. And I had given it all 3. The breaking point came during a late-season search for a missing teenager. Local kid. Grew up around these woods. Knew the trails better than most. He had gone out alone, confident in a way only youth allows, and vanished 3 miles from the nearest road. I found his footprints just before dusk, leading toward a cave system I had hoped never to revisit. The tracks were erratic, uneven, as if he had been walking backward at times. Stopping, turning, hesitating. There were other prints too, larger, deeper. They overlapped his in places, obscuring direction, confusing distance. It was like something had been pacing him, calling him. As I followed the trail, the temperature dropped sharply, breath frosting thick in the air. The forest grew unnaturally still, wind dying away until the silence pressed in on me from all sides. I became acutely aware of my own body, the rasp of breath, the crunch of snow, the faint tremor in my hands I could no longer ignore. Near the cave entrance, I found the boy's jacket hanging from a branch. It wasn't torn, it was placed there. Sleeves draped carefully, zipper pulled halfway up. Inside the cave, I heard movement, not footsteps, not breathing, something shifting its weight. I knew with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely that if I went inside, I would not come back out. That whatever waited in that dark did not intend harm in the way we understand it. It intended continuation. Learning. I backed away, heart hammering, radio shaking in my grip. I called for backup, voice tight, controlled by muscle memory rather than calm. As I turned, the sound came again. 3 knocks. But this time they came from behind me, from the trees. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't try to reason or rationalize or catalog. I ran because something ancient had finally made its expectations clear, and I wanted no part of them. The search was eventually called off, officially unresolved. Another name added to a list no one likes to acknowledge. I stayed on for another year after that, though I don't know why. Habit, stubbornness, maybe guilt, but I was no longer the same ranger. I avoided solitude. I trusted nothing I heard without visual confirmation. I slept with lights on, radios charged, doors barricaded in ways that would have embarrassed my younger self. And still, the forest pressed closer. It began to appear in my dreams even when I wasn't sleeping. Flickers at the edge of vision, the sense of being followed without movement. Sometimes, in reflective surfaces, I thought I saw something standing just behind me. Tall, indistinct, its outline wrong in ways my mind refused to fully process. I eventually left the service altogether. Early retirement. Medical grounds. They didn't argue. Now, years later, I live far from any forest worth naming. Flatland, open sky, places where sound behaves the way it should, but when night falls and the wind finds just the right angle, I still hear it. Not knocking anymore, whispering, practicing voices, waiting for the next person who believes the forest is only trees. Time passed in the way it always does when you try not to look at it directly. Years slipped by without ceremony. I built a life that was intentionally small, routine work, predictable days, nights spent indoors with walls thin enough to remind me I was surrounded by other people. I stopped hiking, stopped camping. Even the smell of pine cleaner in grocery stores made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain without sounding unwell. I told myself that was recovery, but recovery implies something has ended. What I learned, slowly and against my will, was that some experiences do not conclude. They recede. They sink below the surface of your life and wait for stillness to return. It was during a winter storm, years after I had last worn the uniform, that I finally understood the full shape of what had followed me. The power went out just after midnight. Wind howled across open fields, rattling the windows with a violence that felt personal. I lit a lantern and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the house creak and settle. No trees nearby, no forest, nothing that should have made me uneasy. And yet, unease crept in anyway. It started with sound, a low, rhythmic pressure beneath the storm's noise, so faint at first I thought it was the wind passing over some distant structure. But it didn't fade or change with the gusts. It stayed steady, measured, 3 beats, pause. 3 beats. The same pattern that had once echoed through pine and stone now traveled through open air, impossibly close. I stood, lantern shaking slightly in my hand, and followed the sound to the back of the house. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below, from the crawl space. Rational thought surged forward, desperate to assert itself. Old houses make noise, temperature changes, pipes, animals. I recited the list like a prayer, even as my body refused to move any closer to the door. Then the smell seeped up through the floorboards. Cold, damp. That same wrong musk layered with the mineral tang of wet stone. Caves. The storm outside seemed to dim, sound dropping away as if the world had narrowed its focus to that one space beneath my feet. I realized with a clarity that made my hands go numb that distance had never mattered. Forests were not the source. They were the doorway. The knocking stopped. I waited, breath shallow, every sense stretched thin. Seconds passed, then minutes. I almost convinced myself it was over. That was when I heard movement under the floor. Slow. Careful. Something shifting its weight the way I had heard it do in caves, in the dark places where sound behaves differently. The boards creaked. Not randomly, but in sequence, as if something were mapping the structure from below. Learning, a memory surfaced then, sharp and unwelcome. The laughter I had heard near the cave, pleased and patient. The sense that I had violated an unspoken rule by leaving. This was not pursuit. It was correction. I backed away, lantern light flickering wildly, and retreated to the front of the house. My phone had no signal. The storm had cut off the outside world as effectively as any forest ever had. The first whisper came not from below, but from within my own head. My name, spoken softly, intimately, the way someone speaks when they're standing very close behind you. I turned. Nothing was there, but the air felt crowded. I don't remember deciding to leave. I only remember being in my car, engine roaring as I tore down the road in whiteout conditions, fear finally overriding caution. I drove until dawn broke and the storm loosened its grip, until I reached a place with lights and people and noise that drowned out thought. I never went back to that house. In the months that followed, I started searching for answers, not official ones. Stories. Accounts buried in local archives, old ranger logs, handwritten journals scanned and forgotten. Patterns emerged that made my stomach sink. Rangers who quit suddenly after long tenures in certain regions. Notes about unexplained sounds near cave systems. Mentions of something tall, indistinct, seen at the edge of lantern light. Always the same themes. Sound. Imitation. Learning. And caves. They appeared in every account, regardless of forest or state. As if the land itself held pockets where something could wait, preserved and patient, touching the surface world only through those openings. One journal entry stayed with me more than the rest. An unnamed ranger, writing over a century ago, described a belief passed down by local tribes, a warning, not a legend. He wrote that there were things that watched humanity the way we watch animals. Curious, detached, not cruel, but not kind. They do not hunt, he wrote. They study, and they favor those who believe themselves guardians. I stopped reading after that. Some knowledge doesn't illuminate, it corners. I understand now why the forest pressed so hard against my reason, why denial felt safer than acceptance. To truly accept what I encountered would mean acknowledging that there are systems of attention older than us, quieter than us, that do not require belief to function. The caves are not buried secrets. They are mouths, and the forests are where those mouths learn to speak. I don't know if what I encountered could be called a spirit or a creature or something else entirely. Labels are comforts. They make the unknown feel smaller. All I know is that it listens, it imitates, and once it learns the sound of you, your voice, your fear, your habits, it does not forget. I share these stories now not as warnings in the dramatic sense, but as truths stripped of romance. The woods are not evil. They are not malevolent. They are patient. And patience, when paired with curiosity, can be far more dangerous than anger. I no longer see myself as a protector of wilderness. That illusion died somewhere between pine shadows and cave breath. What I am now is a witness, one of many, scattered across time, each of us having glimpsed the same shape from different angles and survived by accident or instinct. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not about courage or conquest. It is about humility. About understanding that some places are not meant to be fully known and some silences are not empty. The spirits of the pines are real, not as ghosts or myths, but as reminders. That reason is fragile. That darkness does not need to chase. And that once something has learned your name, it may carry it far beyond the forest, whispering it softly, patiently, until you finally understand you were never meant to leave unchanged. I found the first set of tracks behind the evidence shed, pressed into a skin of late frost that should not have held weight that cleanly. Elk tracks, but wrong, too deep, too deliberate, as if whatever made them had stopped, adjusted its stance, then continued on with intent. I stood there longer than I should have. The radio crackled on my shoulder, and I didn't answer it. I was listening instead to the silence that had settled after the storm, the kind that presses down on your ears until you're sure something must be wrong with them. I remember thinking that the quiet felt staged, curated, like a set built to convince someone they were alone. I've been a ranger for 23 years. Federal, sworn, trained, evaluated, psychologically screened more times than I can count. I chose this job because I needed space between myself and people. Because after the disappearance in '09, after what I did and didn't report, I couldn't stand rooms anymore. Walls felt like witnesses. Trees don't ask questions. That morning, the forest did. The station sits in a valley most maps don't bother to label. Officially, it's part of a protected corridor. Unofficially, it's where problem assignments go to age out, missing hikers with expired permits, illegal camps that dissolve before we arrive. Search and rescue calls that end with unable to locate, stamped across the final report like a confession no one reads twice. I was alone that week. 2 transfers had put in for reassignment within days of arriving. One cited insomnia. The other said the area felt occupied. HR hates language like that. They like causes, mold, radon, structural integrity, things you can scrape or seal. I followed the tracks around the back of the station, past the generator, past the buried fuel tank, until they stopped at the concrete foundation. No sign of struggle, no scuffing, just a set of impressions ending at the wall, as if the animal had stood there and considered the building before deciding not to go any further. Elk don't do that. I told myself it was melt distortion, weight distribution. The brain is generous when it wants to survive. I scraped the frost smooth with my boot and went inside. That was the first mistake. The smell hit me immediately. Wet fur, old copper, something faintly sulfurous like a struck match that had burned out hours ago. The station is small, 2 rooms, a bunk, kitchenette, office. Nowhere for smells to hide. I opened windows, checked the crawl space hatch. Nothing. When I turned back, there were antler marks on the glass. Not cracks, not scratches. Smears, as if something had pressed the blunt ends of antlers against the window and leaned forward, resting its weight there. Fogged breath marked the inside of the glass, though the room was warm and the air outside was below freezing. I stepped back. My hand went to my sidearm before I realized it had moved. That scared me more than the marks. Muscle memory doesn't trigger without reason. I wiped the glass with my sleeve. The fog did not dissipate. It reformed, slowly, as if breathing were happening somewhere else. I told myself it was temperature differential. I told myself I needed coffee. At 06117, the first call came in. Local frequency. No ID, just a voice, low, calm, male, asking if we were still open. I responded with protocol, identified myself, asked for coordinates. The voice paused, then said, "Good, you're still here." The line went dead. I logged it. I shouldn't have. Some things shouldn't be written down. Once they're on paper, they exist in ways you can't argue with. By mid-morning, the snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, the kind that dampens sound and erases edges. Visibility dropped to 30 yards. I did a perimeter check anyway. Habit. Fear dressed as diligence. That's when I saw it. It stood at the tree line, just beyond where the snow thinned and the forest began to swallow light. An elk. Tall, broad, antlers wide enough to catch falling snow and hold it like offerings. Perfectly still. I raised my binoculars. Its eyes were gone. Not missing. Not injured. Gone. Smooth skin stretched where sockets should have been, unbroken, unscarred, like the face of a statue left unfinished. The head tilted slightly, as if listening. I lowered the binoculars, raised them again. It hadn't moved, but the distance had closed. 10 yards, maybe less. No tracks in the snow between us. My chest tightened, cold pressure, invisible and firm, as if hands were pressing inward. I tried to speak. Nothing came out. The elk opened its mouth. I have heard elk bugle before. In mating season, their calls rip through valleys like metal tearing. This was not that. This was breath shaped like a word but emptied of sound. The jaw moved. The throat worked. Snow fell into its mouth and did not melt. Behind it, the forest shifted. Trees leaned. Not wind-driven. Purposeful. As if something deeper was adjusting the set. I took a step back. The elk took none, but the pressure increased, a vibration in the ground that climbed my legs and settled behind my eyes. Images flashed, too fast to grasp. A man in an orange vest kneeling by a frozen lake. A woman screaming underground, her voice echoing back wrong. Antlers scraping concrete. I fired. The shot cracked the silence like glass. Recoil bit into my shoulder. The elk did not flinch. When the smoke cleared, it was gone. No blood. No tracks. No sound of retreat. Just the station behind me, windows dark, door ajar. Inside, the smell was stronger. On the office desk lay a file I had not opened in 14 years. A missing persons report from '09, the one I never finished. The one with my signature on the last page and nothing written in the cause of disappearance field. Across the top, in handwriting that was not mine, someone had written, "It remembers you." I sat down. The chair creaked. The walls breathed. Outside, something brushed my ankle. I did not look down. I stayed seated longer than was reasonable, longer than training would excuse. My boots planted flat on the floor as if the pressure of my weight could anchor me to something solid. The brushing sensation at my ankle lingered like static, then faded, leaving behind the certainty that it had not been imagined. I did not look down because I already knew what I would not see. Nothing ever leaves evidence when it wants you to doubt yourself. The walls made a soft, ticking sound as the heating system cycled. It sounded too rhythmic, too patient. I forced myself to stand. The chair legs scraped loudly against the floor, the sound snapping something in my head back into place. I drew my sidearm again, this time consciously, and swept the room. Corners, doorway, crawlspace hatch. Nothing. The smell was strongest near the bunk, clinging to the wool blanket like damp breath. I peeled the fabric back and found frost beneath it, a perfect oval pressed into the mattress as if something heavy and cold had lain there recently. "Elk don't come inside." I said it out loud. The sound of my own voice steadied me for half a second, then the radio crackled again. No call sign, no identifier, just the same low male voice, closer now, as if he were standing just outside the door. "You shouldn't have fired," it said. My hand tightened around the grip. "Identify yourself." A pause, a faint sound in the background, like hooves shifting on concrete. "You already know who I am," the voice replied. "You just don't want to say it." The transmission ended with a soft click that echoed in the room, though the radio speaker should not have been capable of that kind of depth. I logged it anyway. Time. Frequency. Content. Habit is a hard thing to kill. I suited up and stepped outside. The snow had stopped, too abruptly. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, carrying warmth it shouldn't have had. My breath fogged, but the fog sank instead of rising, pooling around my boots before being drawn away toward the tree line like smoke pulled by a vacuum. The elk stood closer now, at the edge of the clearing. No tracks leading to it. No sign of approach. It was simply there, its massive body blocking the narrow trail that led down into the valley. Antlers stretched outward, asymmetrical now, one tine broken and capped with something dark that looked wet even in the cold. Still no eyes. Its head turned slowly, deliberately, until the smooth planes of its face angled toward me. The skin where eyes should have been puckered faintly as if something beneath were pressing outward. Testing. I raised my weapon again. My hands were steady. That frightened me more than the shaking ever would have. "Back away," I ordered. The elk did not move. Instead, the ground behind it shifted. Snow collapsed inward, revealing a dark depression I had never seen before, a hole where there should not have been one. The edges were too clean, too circular, as if something had been excavated from below rather than dug from above. The elk opened its mouth again. This time, sound came out. Not a call, not an animal noise. A human breath, ragged and shallow, followed by a voice I recognized immediately, my own, older. tired. "We didn't mean to leave him," the voice said from inside the elk's throat. "It was an accident." I staggered back. The pressure returned, heavier now, compressing my chest until each breath felt like lifting weight. My vision tunneled. At the edges, the forest leaned inward, trees bowing as if in deference to something unseen. Images flooded me again, slower this time, clearer. The frozen lake, winter's search. A missing boy, 12 years old, last seen wearing a red hat and boots 2 sizes too big. The ice thinner than it should have been. The crack that sounded like a gunshot. The way the water closed over him without splash. The report I filed said, "Unable to locate remains." It did not mention the footprints leading away from the break. It did not mention the cave entrance I found later, half hidden by snowdrift and brush, exhaling warm air that smelled of rot and fur. It did not mention the antler marks on the stone inside. I had told myself the boy was dead. The elk took a step forward. Snow crunched beneath its weight now, finally acknowledging physics. With each step, the hole behind it widened, revealing a sloping tunnel reinforced with timber and rusted metal. An old mining shaft, or something repurposed. Something sealed once and reopened recently. "You closed it," the voice said, "still mine. You signed off. You let it stay hungry." The antlers scraped against each other as the elk lowered its head. The sound vibrated through my bones, a low metallic groan that set my teeth on edge. I tasted blood where my gums split. "I didn't know," I whispered. The elk stopped inches from me. Heat radiated from its body, incongruous against the snow. I could smell it now clearly. Wet fur, decay, something electric like ozone. Up close, I could see movement beneath the skin of its face, shapes pressing and withdrawing, as if something inside were trying to remember how eyes worked. "You always know," it said, and this time the voice came from everywhere at once. The trees, the ground, the air behind my ears. You just choose which truths to file away. Behind it, the tunnel breathed. I heard voices from below. Multiple, layered. Men and women, children and adults, some crying, some whispering, some laughing softly as if sharing a joke I wasn't meant to hear. The sound echoed wrong, bending back on itself, repeating phrases out of order. I recognized some of the names. Rangers, hikers, locals, people I had written reports about, people who had come back wrong. The elk stepped aside, clearing the path to the tunnel. Its head dipped once, almost a gesture of invitation, or command. My radio crackled again, this time a different voice. "Dispatch. Normal. Concerned. Station, we've lost your signal intermittently. Do you copy?" I looked back at the building. The station lights flickered weakly. For a moment, I saw silhouettes moving behind the windows, tall and branching, pacing the walls as if waiting. "No," I said, though I didn't know who I was answering anymore. "I don't copy." The pressure lifted suddenly, replaced by a cold so intense it felt like needles driven into my skin. Frost bloomed across my sleeves. My breath came out in white plumes that were immediately pulled toward the tunnel mouth. The elk turned its eyeless face toward the dark and began to descend, hooves striking wood and metal with a hollow, echoing cadence. The voices below grew louder. I followed. The tunnel swallowed sound first, then light. I descended behind it, boots slipping on damp timber slick with something that wasn't water. My flashlight beam jittered against the walls, catching old warning signs half scraped away, their lettering gouged deep as if someone had tried to erase them with a knife. The air grew warmer with every step, humid and foul, carrying the layered smells of rust, wet fur, rot, and something older, something mineral and ancient, like stone that has remembered too much. The elk moved ahead of me without hesitation. Its hooves struck the reinforced floor with a deliberate rhythm, each impact reverberating through the tunnel and into my chest. I felt it in my ribs, my teeth, the back of my skull. With each step, the pressure behind my eyes returned, pulsing in time with that sound, dragging images up from places I had buried carefully. The boy again, his red hat floating on dark water. His boots walking away from the ice without him. I forced myself to breathe through my mouth. The air tasted metallic. Every inhale left a film on my tongue that made me want to gag. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, then steadied, though I hadn't touched it. The beams stretched strangely here, shadows bending at angles that made no architectural sense. The tunnel was wider than it should have been for a mine shaft. The ceiling arched too smoothly, walls carved with marks that looked like tool gouges until I realized they followed patterns. Spirals, branching lines, repeated over and over as if someone had been practicing a symbol they could never quite finish. Voices echoed ahead. Not a chorus, a crowd. They overlapped and bled together, sometimes resolving into clear phrases before dissolving back into noise. He said it was safe. They told us to wait. It comes back when you're alone. I stumbled as the ground sloped sharply downward. The elk did not slow. Its massive body moved with a familiarity that made my stomach twist, as if it had walked this path many times before, as if this was not a place it visited, but one it returned to. The tunnel opened suddenly into a cavern vast enough that my light couldn't find the far walls. The ceiling vanished into darkness, though I could hear something moving up there. Slow, deliberate scraping sounds like antlers dragged across stone. The floor was uneven, broken by pits and ridges, some natural, some cut. In the center stood a structure that did not belong underground. A building. Concrete walls, poured thick and reinforced with steel, their surfaces stained with age and something darker. A bunker. Military grade. The door hung open, bent outward as if forced from the inside. Frost rimed its edges despite the heat in the cavern, the cold radiating outward in a low mist that crept along the floor. The elk stopped at the threshold and turned its head toward me. Up close, the absence of eyes was worse. The skin there quivered now, stretched thin, translucent in places. Beneath it, something moved. Shapes pressed forward and withdrew as if testing the barrier, learning where to push. You built it to watch, the voices said, no longer trying to sound like me. They layered over one another, rising and falling, at male and female and child, some whispering, some shouting. You built it to listen. You built it to contain. I didn't, I said, though the words felt weak even to me. This wasn't my project. The elk's jaw opened wider than anatomy should allow. Its mouth stretched, skin tearing at the corners, revealing darkness inside that swallowed my flashlight beam whole. Your uniform did, it replied. I remembered the classified briefing from years ago, the one that had come down through channels we weren't supposed to question. A restricted zone established overnight. Anomalous activity dismissed as seismic irregularities. Reports rerouted, disappearances reclassified. We were told to redirect hikers, to discourage exploration, to file incidents under wildlife encounters and environmental hazards. We were told not to enter the tunnels. The bunker interior was worse. The walls were lined with equipment long since abandoned, monitors cracked and dark, cables chewed through or torn free. Rusted restraints hung from reinforced chairs bolted to the floor. The smell inside was unbearable now, old blood, ammonia, burned hair. I recognized it instantly, though I had never smelled it here before. Interrogation rooms. At the far end, a corridor sloped downward again, narrower, darker. The voices came from there, clearer now, individual faces forming in my mind unbidden. People I had known, people whose names I could recite along with case numbers and dates. The elk stepped inside. As it passed through the doorway, the temperature dropped violently. Frost raced across the concrete floor in branching patterns that mirrored the carvings in the tunnel walls. The bunker lights flickered on without power, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. In the reflection of a cracked monitor, I saw myself. Or something wearing me. Antlers rose from my head, ghostly and half-formed, branching and retracting like shadows cast by a fire that wasn't there. My eyes in the reflection were dark hollows, skin stretched smooth over them. My mouth moved when I didn't speak. I tore my gaze away and staggered forward, drawn by the voices despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The corridor narrowed until my shoulders brushed the walls. The vibrations returned, stronger now, rattling the fillings in my teeth. Something brushed my ankle again, more insistent this time, fingers or roots curling briefly around my boot before withdrawing. The corridor opened into a chamber that stole what breath I had left. The floor dropped away in pits so deep my light couldn't find the bottom. Wooden platforms jutted out over it at irregular intervals, connected by ladders and narrow walkways. Many were broken, some were stained dark, others were occupied. They stood motionless, facing the pit. Men and women in various states of decay and preservation, their uniforms and clothing marking decades of disappearances. Some wore ranger green, some wore civilian jackets, some were barefoot, their feet blackened and cracked. All of them stood perfectly still, heads tilted slightly downward, as if listening. At the edge of the pit, embedded in the rock, was something vast and indistinct. A mass of antler-like structures fused together, branching endlessly, pulsing faintly with heat. The air around it shimmered, warping light and sound. This was where it fed. The elk stepped onto the nearest platform and lowered its head toward the pit. The mass below responded, vibrations surging upward, the voices rising into a cacophony that pressed against my skull until I cried out. "You keep watch," it said. "You keep us fed." I saw then what the platforms were for. Not restraints, not sacrifices, witnesses. People placed just close enough to be seen, just far enough to be unreachable. Left to stand and listen until something inside them broke and they stepped forward on their own. I felt my feet move. I fought it, digging my heels into the concrete, but the pull was relentless, a gravity that had nothing to do with physics. The antlered mass below pulsed brighter, heat washing over me in waves despite the frost creeping up my legs. The elk turned its eyeless face toward me one last time. "It comes back to the station," it said softly, "because you always do." I don't remember deciding to step onto the platform. I remember the sensation of weight shifting, of balance being taken from me the way breath is taken underwater, quietly, without violence, until panic arrives too late. The concrete vanished beneath my boots and was replaced by old, splintered wood slick with frost and something tacky that clung when I lifted my foot. The pit breathed. That was the only word for it, a slow, tidal inhale that pulled sound, heat, and thought downward. The antlered mass at the center pulsed in response, its branching structures flexing like muscles beneath bark. I could see now that the antlers were not singular. They were fused. Dozens, hundreds, some bleached white, some dark with age, some still wet. Each one ended in a human shape. Faces, partially formed, mouths open in permanent mid-syllable, eyes either closed in relief or stretched wide in an expression that had curdled long past fear. The closer ones still had skin, the farther ones were polished bone. Witnesses who had stayed too long. The voices weren't coming from the pit anymore. They were inside me. Thoughts arriving fully formed, wearing my memories like borrowed clothes. You filed us away. You stood above and listened. You learned how to leave. My knees buckled. I caught myself on the railing, metal cold enough to burn. The frost had climbed past my calves now, spiderwebbing upward, but the heat from below fought it constantly, creating a nauseating alternation, burn, freeze, burn, that made my vision swim. Across the pit, one of the figures moved, just slightly, a head turning by degrees that would have been imperceptible if I hadn't been watching already. I recognized him immediately. Ranger Collins. Disappeared 8 years ago during a winter patrol. Presumed hypothermia. I had signed that report too. His lips moved. "They told me you'd come back," he whispered. The sound didn't travel through air. It arrived directly behind my eyes. I didn't know, I said again, the lie tasting stale even as I formed it. Collins smiled. The expression cracked his face, skin splitting along old frostbite scars. "None of us do. Not until we're close enough to hear it think." The elk stepped onto the platform behind me. The wood creaked under its weight, but held, always held. It lowered its massive head until its antlers brushed my shoulders, a mockery of intimacy. Heat radiated from it in waves, smelling of wet fur and iron. "You stayed rational longer than most," it said. "That's why you're useful." I felt something press against my back. Not the elk, but something else. A shape that did not respect edges. It slid through the air like a shadow cast by no object, settling over my shoulders, my spine, my skull. The pressure was immense but precise, as if hands were aligning me with something unseen. Images cascaded through me. The bunker when it was new. Scientists in white coats, soldiers with rifles they never raised, cameras trained on the pit, microphones lowered into the dark. The first time it entered back, not with words, but with patterns, heat spikes, vibrations, mimicry. It had learned by listening. People were brought down not to feed it, but to teach it, to give it voices, faces, reactions. The elk shape came later, something familiar, something the land already understood as powerful, untouchable, something that could walk. I screamed when it pressed deeper, when my thoughts began to echo back to me, a half-second delayed, wrong in tone and emphasis. I felt myself splitting, awareness stretching thin as something else tried to fit inside the space I occupied. "This is how it returns," a voice inside me said calmly. "This is how it keeps the station occupied." The frost reached my waist. The heat scorched my chest. My heart hammered erratically, each beat sounding too loud, too isolated. I thought of the station, the empty rooms, the antler marks on the glass, the way the elk always came back there, waiting, standing just outside, patient. It needed a door. I don't know what gave me the strength to move. Maybe guilt, maybe panic, maybe the last stubborn fragment of myself that refused to be archived. I lunged forward. The railing snapped beneath my weight, metal shrieking as it tore free. I fell hard onto the platform, sliding toward the pit, fingers scrabbling uselessly against frost-slick wood. The pull intensified instantly, a roaring silence that filled my head. Hands grabbed me. Real hands. Human. Cold and shaking. Collins. Two others I didn't recognize. Their grips were iron despite the way their arms trembled, muscles straining against something that wanted me below. "Don't listen," Collins hissed. "Don't let it finish the shape." The elk roared. Not a sound, an event. The cavern shook violently, antlers above scraping stone, dust raining down in choking clouds. The mass below surged upward, antlered faces stretching and contorting, mouths opening wide as the voices screamed in unison. "Come back." I kicked blindly, my boot striking something solid. The elk's leg. It stumbled, surprise rippling through it like a physical thing. The pressure on my mind faltered for half a heartbeat. That was enough. Collins and the others heaved, dragging me backward across the platform. My fingers caught on a ladder rung. Someone shoved me hard, and I tumbled onto solid ground, gasping like I'd broken the surface of deep water. The frost retreated instantly. The heat vanished. The pit roared in fury behind us. The elk staggered, its form blurring like edges smearing as if it were being pulled in multiple directions at once. Its head snapped toward me, skin over its eyeless sockets bulging violently. "This isn't over," it said, voice cracking into a dozen others. "You're still marked." The bunker lights exploded in showers of sparks. Alarms I didn't recognize wailed to life, shrill and panicked. Somewhere above, the tunnel groaned, timbers splintering. Collins shoved me toward the corridor. "Run," he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, he sounded afraid. "If you stay, it learns faster." I ran. I don't remember the climb out. I remember pain. I remember darkness collapsing inward. I remember voices chasing me up the tunnel, calling my name in tones that matched people I loved and people I'd failed. When I burst out into daylight, the station was burning. Flames licked at the walls, black smoke pouring into a sky that had turned an impossible shade of orange. Heat rolled across the clearing in waves, melting snow instantly, turning it to steam that screamed as it rose. The elk stood at the edge of the firelight, whole again, unburned, watching. I staggered toward the station anyway, drawn by something I couldn't name. Inside, through the smoke, I could see the desk, the file still open, a pen placed neatly on top, waiting. The heat should have driven me back. Any rational assessment of the situation, fire spread, structural collapse, oxygen depletion, would have ended with me turning away from the station and running until my legs failed. I had taught those assessments to rookies. I had enforced them. I had written them into reports that gathered dust in offices far from here. But rationality had already been hollowed out. I crossed the threshold through smoke so thick it pressed against my eyes like gauze. The fire hadn't taken everything. It never does. The flames avoided the center of the room, crawling the walls instead, licking at shelves and bunks while leaving the desk untouched. Papers lay perfectly flat, unburned, edges curling only slightly as if held in place by invisible hands. The smell was unbearable now, burnt hair layered over copper and wet fur. I tasted it in every breath. The pen rolled gently toward me when I stepped closer. I knew, with a clarity that felt cruel, what it wanted. Completion. The file was thicker than it had been before. New pages had been added, incident reports I did not remember writing, photographs I did not remember taking, grainy images of tunnels, of antlered silhouettes half seen in snowstorms, of people standing at the edge of pits, faces turned downward, eyes reflecting light they should not have been able to see. At the very bottom was a blank form. Cause of disappearance. My hands shook as I picked up the pen. The shaking felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Outside, through the broken windows, I could hear the elk moving, its hooves striking ground with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each step synchronized with the pounding of my heart. The voices returned, quieter now. Patient, you know what to write. You always do. I thought of Collins, of the others still down there, standing on platforms that would never rot away completely. Of the boy at the frozen lake. Of every name I had filed under environmental exposure or animal activity or unknown. The land remembers every scream. I dropped the pen. The sound it made, hitting the desk, was absurdly loud. The flames along the walls surged in response, flaring bright enough to force me to shield my eyes. When I looked again, the file had begun to blacken at the edges, paper curling and blistering. The voices shifted. Confusion rippled through them. No, they whispered. No, no, no. The building shuddered violently. Somewhere beneath the floor, something massive shifted its weight. The antler marks on the glass began to glow faintly, lines of heat tracing their grooves as if something on the other side were pressing closer, harder. The elk bellowed outside. This time it sounded wounded. I ran. I burst through the back door as the roof gave way in a cascade of sparks and ash. The heat at my back was immense, a living thing that chased me into the clearing. I didn't look behind me. I didn't need to. The tree line loomed ahead, dark and waiting. The forest was alive with movement now, branches swaying without wind, shadows sliding between trunks. I felt eyes on me everywhere, felt the land itself paying attention. I made it to the truck by instinct alone. The engine turned over on the first try, an impossible mercy. As I slammed the door and peeled away from the clearing, I caught one last glimpse of the station in the rearview mirror. The elk stood in the flames, not burning, never burning, watching me leave. The road out twisted through terrain that refused to look familiar. Landmarks shifted, mile markers repeated. At one point, I passed the same fallen tree 3 times, each time from a slightly different angle, each time closer to dusk, though the sun should have been rising. The radio crackled constantly. Voices bled through, dispatchers, rangers, civilians, all speaking in fragments, all circling the same themes. Reports, missing persons, unresolved cases. My name threaded through them like a refrain. I didn't answer. When I finally crossed the boundary line, the invisible edge where the forest's influence loosened its grip, the world snapped back into place so abruptly it made me nauseous. Cell service returned, GPS stabilized. The sky settled into a normal, harmless blue. I pulled over and vomited until there was nothing left. They found the station the next day, or what was left of it. Electrical fire, the official report said. Old wiring, tragic but explainable. No bodies recovered, no sign of tunnels beneath the foundation. Ground-penetrating radar turned up nothing but rock. They asked me to walk them through it. I told them everything except the truth. I resigned a week later. Early retirement on medical grounds, exhaustion, trauma. The kind of words that close doors gently instead of slamming them. I thought it was over. It wasn't. The elk still comes back. Not every night. Not predictably. Sometimes I see it reflected in dark windows when I pass by at just the wrong angle. Sometimes I hear hooves on concrete in parking garages. Sometimes I wake up with the smell of wet fur and smoke in my nose and frost creeping across my sheets in the middle of summer. It waits. It wants me to finish the file. I haven't. I don't know how long I can keep refusing. I can feel it learning, adapting, shaping itself to the spaces I leave unguarded. The land remembers, and it is patient. If this recording is found, if anyone is listening to this who wears the uniform now, do not stay alone. Do not ignore the things that come back. Do not file away what you don't understand. Some disappearances are intentional, and some of us are only free because we are still unfinished. The first time the forest made me feel watched, it wasn't because of what I saw. It was because of what went silent. I was 38 years old then, a ranger with more winters behind me than ahead, and I believed, truly believed, that the woods followed rules if you respected them. I had worked these mountains long enough to know how sound should behave. Wind combing the crowns of pine, distant water breaking over rock, birds arguing over territory like old men at a diner. Noise meant order. Silence meant something had changed. My name is Elias. I've worn the uniform of a forest ranger in the Northern Rockies for nearly 2 decades, long enough that locals stopped asking my name and just nodded when they saw the truck. They called me when cattle went missing, when hunters didn't come home, when hikers swore the trail had moved overnight. I worked a district where the pines grew tight and tall, their needles locking out light so completely that noon could feel like dusk. The old families lived at the forest's edge and spoke of it like a neighbor you tolerated but never trusted. They'd lower their voices when the wind came from the high ridges. They'd say the spirits were restless. I'd smile, write my notes, and tell myself stories were just another form of weather. That confidence carried me through most days. It carried me on the morning the silence first arrived. I was checking a backcountry cabin near a glacial creek, one of those assignments that looks simple on paper and feels heavier once you're there. The air had a sharpness to it, a cold that pinched the inside of your nose even in late summer. My boots sank into a mat of needles so thick they swallowed sound. I remember noticing how clean the forest smelled. Too clean. No rot, no musk, none of the animal stink that usually clung to low places. Just resin and stone, like a room scrubbed after something bad had happened. Halfway down the trail, the birds stopped. It wasn't sudden, it was like a hand turning a dial. One call faded, then another, until the forest held its breath. I slowed, listening for my own steps, for the crunch that should have followed each footfall. The silence pressed against my ears until I felt it in my teeth. I told myself it was nothing, weather shift, predator passing through, but my body didn't listen. My shoulders tightened, my grip on the radio went white-knuckled. That was when I heard the knock. 3 sounds, evenly spaced, hollow and deep, like someone rapping on a thick wooden door with bare knuckles. Not a branch, not rock, wood. It came from upslope, beyond the tree line where the ground rose steep and broken. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for the echo that never came. The forest swallowed the sound whole, leaving only the memory of it vibrating in my chest. I reported it as unknown noise. That's what we write when we don't want to admit we don't know. I finished the cabin check, found nothing out of place, and told myself the woods were teaching me humility. Still, as I drove back down the access road, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. He looked older, tighter, as if something had followed me out and taken a seat behind my eyes. The next weeks brought small things. Tracks that didn't match anything in the book, too wide, too deep, toes set like a man's but stretched wrong, as if the foot had been pulled. A smell that crept into modes on certain nights, damp and sour, like wet fur left too long in the sun. And the sounds. Always the sounds. A call at dusk that rose and fell like a voice learning how to be human. A thud against the side of a lookout tower when the wind was dead still. Once, while doing a night patrol, I heard my own name carried on the air, pronounced carefully, as if whoever said it was afraid of getting it wrong. I didn't tell anyone about that last part. Rangers learn early what to share and what to keep. Fear spreads faster than fire, and once it's loose, you don't get to decide where it burns. So I handled it the way I handled everything else, methodically. I doubled patrols in the high country. I checked in with trappers who knew the land better than any map. I reminded myself of bears standing upright, of elk calls that fooled the untrained ear. I told myself there was a rational explanation waiting patiently for me to arrive. Denial has a rhythm of its own. It's comforting. It lets you keep moving. The night it broke, the temperature dropped so fast it felt like the forest had exhaled all at once. I was alone at the North Lookout, a squat structure perched on a ridge where the trees thinned and the wind had teeth. The stove crackled, throwing heat that never quite reached my hands. Outside, the pines swayed without sound, their silhouettes scraping the sky. I was writing reports by headlamp when the knock came again, 3 times, closer now, resonating through the tower's bones. I froze. The smell hit me a second later, thick and animal, pushing past the clean pine until my stomach turned. I didn't reach for the door. I didn't speak. I counted my breaths and listened as something moved around the base of the tower, slow and deliberate, each step compressing the earth with a weight that felt wrong for any animal I knew. There was a scrape, then a pause, then a sound that haunts me still. A low huff, warm and wet, drawn out like someone savoring a scent. The tower shuddered, just enough to rattle the cups on the shelf. My radio hissed with static, then cleared, then died. I remember thinking with an odd calm that this was how men disappeared, quietly, without witnesses, folded into the stories locals whispered and outsiders dismissed. When the steps retreated, I waited until dawn. The light came gray and thin, revealing tracks circling the tower. Each print pressed so deep, it broke through the needle mat to the frozen soil beneath. I didn't follow them. That was the first lesson I learned. Curiosity is a luxury the forest charges interest on. I filed my report with shaking hands and told my supervisor I needed time. Time to think. Time to remember why I'd chosen this life in the first place. The woods had always been my refuge, a place where the world made sense if you paid attention. Now they felt like a ledger of debts I didn't know I owed. The locals noticed the change in me before I did. They asked fewer questions. They left offerings at trailheads, coins, bits of cloth, once a small carved figure placed carefully at the base of a pine. I didn't touch those. Some boundaries, once drawn, should stay that way. I kept working. I always did. But the confidence was gone, replaced by a vigilance that never slept. Each patrol felt like a negotiation, each step a question. And somewhere in the high country, something listened, learning my patterns, waiting for the moment when reason would finally fail me completely. I told myself vigilance was enough, that if I stayed alert, if I respected the old rhythms, whatever haunted those ridges would remain a rumor instead of a reckoning. That belief lasted until the cave. The cave had always been there. A limestone wound in the mountainside, half hidden by fallen timber and a curtain of moss that never quite dried. Locals avoided it without admitting why. They'd talk around it, mention bad air or unstable rock, and change the subject. In my early years, I logged it as a hazard site and moved on. Now it began to surface in my thoughts uninvited, like a word on the tip of the tongue you can't shake. The first time I was assigned there after the tower incident, my hands went numb on the steering wheel. The radio crackled with mundane chatter, trail closures, weather updates, and I clung to it like a lifeline. The air thickened as I climbed, carrying that familiar damp fir scent, faint but undeniable. I parked farther out than protocol required and walked the rest, every step measured, my breath fogging in the cold. The entrance yawned wider than I remembered. Darkness pooled inside, swallowing light with an appetite that felt personal. I stood at the threshold, listening. The forest behind me hummed with low life, wind, distant water, but the cave offered nothing. No drip, no echo. Just a pressure that pressed back when I leaned in as if the dark had weight. I told myself this was where reason mattered most. I flicked on my headlamp and stepped inside. Sound behaved differently there. My boots made no echo, as if the stone drank it whole. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a mineral tang that coated my tongue. My light carved shallow shapes from the dark, walls slick with moisture, old claw marks I couldn't quite explain, grooves worn smooth by something heavy passing through again and again. I felt watched, not from one direction but from everywhere at once, the way you feel when you're the only moving thing in a room full of mirrors. Halfway in, the temperature dropped sharply, a knife of cold that slid under my jacket and found my spine. I stopped, listening to my own pulse thunder in my ears. That was when I heard the breathing. Slow. Controlled. Too steady to be panic. Too deep to be human. It came from ahead, then shifted, circling without footfalls. My light shook as I turned, catching nothing but stone. I whispered a warning, habit more than hope, and the breathing paused as if listening back. Denial tried to surface then. I told myself it was air moving through fissures, water finding new paths. The cave answered with a sound like a chuckle, low and rumbling, vibrating through the rock until my teeth chattered. I backed away, heart slamming, and the darkness seemed to lean forward, closing the distance with a patience that felt ancient. I ran. I don't remember turning around. I remember the burn in my lungs, the way the beam of my headlamp bounced wildly, tearing shadows into shapes that reached for me. I remember the sound behind me. Heavy steps now, stone cracking under weight, the breathing close enough that I felt it warm the back of my neck. The exit appeared suddenly, a slice of gray light that felt unreal. I burst into the open and collapsed on the moss, sucking air like I'd been underwater too long. The forest was loud again. Birds screamed. Wind tore through the pines. It felt like being shoved back into the world after standing too close to its edge. I didn't look back at the cave. I didn't need to. I could feel it watching, could feel the dark settle, satisfied. I took leave after that. Officially, it was exhaustion. Unofficially, I didn't trust myself to make the right calls anymore. Sleep became a stranger. When I closed my eyes, I saw stone walls breathing, felt that cold crawl under my skin. I started to doubt my instincts, then my memories. I replayed every incident, searching for the moment I'd crossed a line I didn't know existed. The call that brought me back came at dawn. A hiker missing near the old ridge, last seen heading toward the cave trail. His family was local. I knew them. The thought of them waiting for answers tightened my chest until breathing hurt. Duty has a way of cutting through fear, even when fear has earned its place. I went alone. The trail felt different that morning. The ground was soft, churned as if something had passed recently, leaving prints that blurred at the edges like a bad dream. The air smelled wrong, sweet and rotten all at once. I followed the signs I knew how to read. Broken branches, scuffed stone, a dropped pack snagged on a root. The closer I got, the quieter it became, until even my thoughts seemed too loud. The cave mouth loomed ahead, darker than before. I called out the hiker's name, my voice thin and fragile. It came back to me altered, stretched, and reshaped, a mockery that raised goose flesh on my arms. I stepped inside, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to turn back. But fear of losing someone else outweighed fear for myself. That was the conflict I couldn't escape, protector versus survivor. Deeper in, I found the pack. Beyond it, scuffed marks led into a chamber I hadn't seen before. Wide and high, the ceiling lost in shadow. My light caught movement, something tall, hunched, its outline wrong in ways that defied language. It stood still, breathing slow, head tilted as if considering me. I felt small then, stripped of titles and training, just another animal in a place that didn't belong to me. It spoke. Not words. Not exactly. A sound that carried meaning without language, heavy with memory and warning. Images flooded my mind. Old trails swallowed by forest, men vanishing, bones folding into stone. The cave wasn't just a place. It was a ledger, a mouth that remembered everything it took. I didn't fight. I didn't shout. I lowered my light and backed away. Every step a negotiation. The thing watched, unmoving, until I crossed some invisible line. Then the pressure lifted. The cave released me like a held breath. Outside, I found the hiker alive, dazed, wandering the tree line as if waking from a dream. I guided him back without explanation. Some truths aren't mine to share. I resigned a month later, not because I was broken, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Protection isn't about dominance. It's about knowing when to step aside. I still walk those woods, still listen to the whispers in the pines. I teach the younger rangers what I can, not the stories, but the respect, the pauses, the signs you don't ignore. The forest remains an adversary and a teacher. It presses, distorts, tests the fragile walls we build with reason. Somewhere in the dark, something breathes and remembers. And if you're quiet enough, if you listen past your fear, you might hear what the locals have always known. Some spirits don't want to be found. They want to be acknowledged and left alone. I thought leaving the badge behind would quiet the nights. I believed that distance alone could dull the edge of memory, that without a radio crackling at my hip or a schedule pulling me back into the high country, the forest would loosen its grip. Instead, the woods followed me inward. Silence learned new ways to settle in rooms with walls. Shadows pooled where corners met. And every so often, usually just before sleep, I would catch the faintest echo of that breathing. Slow, patient, as if something had found a way to map the inside of my chest. I stayed near the edge of the district after I resigned, took contract work that kept me close enough to check on people I knew without crossing back into uniform. The locals were kind in the way people are when they don't ask questions they don't want answered. They nodded. They brought food. They let the forest speak for itself. I tried to return the favor by keeping an eye on the trails, by listening for rumors that carried weight instead of wind. They came to me one evening as the light thinned to amber. Two brothers, both grown, both trying to look braver than they felt. They'd lost their father in the woods years back, a man who knew the trails the way some men know their own hands. The official record said exposure. The locals said the cave took him. The brothers said they'd heard knocking near their property, 3 raps, evenly spaced, coming from the trees. They asked me what it meant. I told them to leave offerings at the boundary and keep their distance. I told them to listen more than they spoke. I told them the forest answers attention with attention. It wasn't enough. Fear has momentum, and theirs had been building for years. The knock came to my door that night. It was softer than the tower, gentler than the cave, but the pattern was unmistakable. 3 taps, wood on wood, precise. My house sat on a gravel road with no neighbors close enough to play tricks. I didn't open the door. I stood in the dark, breath shallow, and felt the temperature drop as if winter had decided to test the latch. The smell followed, damp fur and stone, and with it a memory so vivid I tasted metal. I spoke without raising my voice. I acknowledged what was there. I told it I wasn't hunting, wasn't guarding, wasn't trespassing. The taps stopped. The pressure lingered, then eased, like a hand withdrawing. When dawn came, the frost on my steps held impressions that blurred when I stared too long, as if the ground itself didn't want to remember. That was the night I understood the last lesson the forest had been circling for me. It wasn't just about fear or survival. It was about legacy, about what we pass on when we tell stories and when we don't. The woods had taken pieces of me, yes, but they'd also given me a responsibility that didn't end with resignation. I began to write, not reports, but letters, notes to the rangers who would come after me, tucked into old files and left with people I trusted. I didn't describe the thing in the cave. I didn't name it. Names have power, and some power feeds on being called. I wrote about silence, about scent, about the way temperature can lie. I wrote about listening for what isn't there and respecting the line where curiosity turns into hunger. Time moved the way it always does, unevenly. Seasons stacked, snow came and went. The knock faded into a memory I could hold without shaking. I learned to sleep again. I learned to let the forest be present without letting it own me. And then, one winter, a storm rolled in that felt wrong from the start. Wind from the high ridges carrying a low moan that threaded through the trees like a warning. A call came over the old channels, passed hand to hand until it reached me. A new ranger, young and capable, missing near the ridge after checking storm damage. I sat with the decision longer than I care to admit. Fear argued for distance. Duty argued for return. What tipped the balance wasn't bravery, it was recognition. The forest had shaped me for this moment, whether I wanted it to or not. I went back at dawn, following tracks half filled with snow, reading the story the ground was willing to tell. The storm had scoured the trail clean in places, leaving gaps like missing sentences. I filled them with patience. Near the cave, the air thickened, cold enough to sting. I found the ranger's pack where the path bent away, untouched by snow, as if the storm had learned to step around it. Inside, the darkness waited. I didn't turn on my light. I let my eyes adjust. I breathed. The cave breathed back. The presence was there, tall, heavy, old as the first trail cut by fear. It didn't advance. It didn't retreat. It watched. I spoke again, the way I had at my door. I acknowledged the ledger. I asked for what had been taken to be returned, not as a demand, but as an appeal to balance. The cave answered with images that pressed behind my eyes, a boyhood of stone and cold, a learning of shapes, a watching of men who never learned to stop. The thing wasn't evil in the way stories make monsters convenient. It was territorial memory, a guardian born of accumulation and neglect. The ranger stumbled out of the dark, eyes unfocused, alive. I guided him away without looking back. The forest roared as the storm broke, wind tearing through the pines, snow falling hard enough to erase tracks and debts alike. We walked until the sound of the cave was only an echo in my bones. I didn't return after that. I didn't need to. The lesson had come full circle. The woods are not a puzzle to be solved or a beast to be conquered. They are a conversation that began long before us and will continue without our permission. Reason is fragile there, not because it fails, but because it must share space with something older. Now, when people ask about the spirits of the pines, I tell them what I can. I tell them to listen to silence, to respect the places that don't echo, to understand that fear, when faced honestly, can teach restraint. The forest still whispers. Locals still lower their voices when the wind comes from the high ridges. And sometimes, if the night is cold and clean, you can hear a knock far off, not a threat, but a reminder. You are not alone, and you were never meant to be. The last winter I stayed near the forest, I learned how quietly a life can settle into its final shape. Snow fell in steady sheets that year, the kind that dampens sound and blurs distance until the world feels smaller than it should. I spent long evenings by the window, watching the tree line breathe under moonlight, the pines bending and straightening like backs under a load they had carried for centuries. I no longer felt the urge to measure them, to patrol their edges or name their moods. I let them exist without me in the middle of things. People still came from time to time. A young ranger asking for advice without knowing exactly what question he wanted answered. A hiker who swore the trail had changed behind her and needed someone to tell her she wasn't losing her mind. A local who found old bones while cutting firewood and wanted to know whether to call it in or leave it be. I listened. I chose my words with care. I didn't offer certainty. I offered context, because certainty is what the forest strips from you first. On my last walk before spring, I went only as far as the lower pines, where the light filters through and the ground still remembers footsteps. The air smelled clean, honest. Birds argued overhead. Everything behaved the way it should. I stood there longer than necessary, feeling the quiet settle without pressing, and understood something I had resisted since the beginning. Fear hadn't broken me. It had refined me. It had taken the part of me that believed control was the same as safety and worn it down to something more durable. I thought of the cave not as a mouth or a threat, but as a boundary that demanded respect. I thought of the thing within it not as a monster, but as a consequence. We talk about wilderness as if it's empty until we arrive, as if meaning begins with our footsteps. The truth is harder and more humbling. Meaning is already there. It waits to see how we behave. The forest never asked me to leave. It never asked me to stay. It only responded to what I brought into it: confidence, denial, fear, humility. and returned those things changed. That exchange is the lesson locals whisper about and rangers learn too late. It's why some stories don't end with answers and why others end abruptly, folded into silence. As I turned back toward the road, a breeze moved through the pines, carrying a sound that could have been wind, could have been breath. I didn't stop. I didn't run. I acknowledged it with a nod I didn't know I was making and kept walking, the gravel crunching under my boots, the world widening again with each step. I live differently now. I listen longer. I speak less. I teach what I can without trying to own it. When night comes and the forest presses close in memory, I let it. I've learned the difference between being watched and being witnessed. The spirits of the pines are still there. They always will be. Not waiting to be found, not eager to be named, just present, patient, and honest in a way few things are. And if you ever find yourself deep in those woods when the silence feels too complete and the cold carries a scent you can't place, remember this. You don't have to understand everything you encounter. You only have to know when to step back, when to listen, and when to leave the darkness to its keeping. If this account stayed with you, let us know. Comment with what you think was really happening out there, and whether you believe the narrator escaped or was simply allowed to leave. If you want more recorded testimonies like this one, subscribe to Podcast Station. New stories arrive regularly. Some of them never leave. If you want a darker, more minimal, or more documentary-style version, or one tailored for YouTube retention, I can adjust pacing and wording precisely.